Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, it's Mark Graban here. Welcome to episode 451 of the podcast. It's July 27th, 2022. My guest today, a returning guest, is Dr. Alan G. Robinson. His most recent book is called Practical Innovation in Government. But I hope if you don't work in government, please keep listening. We have a conversation that touches on continuous improvement in organizations of all types, manufacturing, healthcare, and of course, different levels of government. So if you do work in government, here's an episode for you. But I think as you'll hear, continuous improvement is continuous improvement, and engaging people is engaging people. Leadership is leadership. So there's common themes here. Alan has a lot of great stories and insights here I think you'll enjoy. So for links to his book and his website and more, you can go to leanblog.org/451. Thanks for listening. Again, our guest today, Dr. Alan G. Robinson. He specializes in managing ideas, building high-performance organizations, creativity, innovation, quality, and lean production. If you don't know him, I hope you do, but if otherwise, a good introduction to him today. He's a co-author of 10 books, or is that now 11 with the new one, Alan, to interrupt the intro?
That's how you count, but 13 is the number I would use right now. I can elaborate if you need it.
13 books. That's a number that's hard to keep updated in bios and the website. Many of those books have been translated into more than 25 languages. Alan's on the faculty of the Isenberg School of Management at the University of Massachusetts. He received his Ph.D. in applied mathematics from, is it the Whiting School or the Whiting School? I'm going to interrupt
Whiting
again.
School, yeah.
At Johns Hopkins University, he has a BA and an MA in mathematics from the University of Cambridge. He served on the Board of Examiners for the U.S. Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, and he's been on the Board of Examiners for the Shingo Prize for Excellence in Manufacturing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Alan, but first off, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you.
So like I said, Alan's a returning guest, episode 217, if you want to go back and listen to that. Back then, we talked about one of his previous books, a great book co-authored, as many of his are, with Dean Schroeder, a book called The Idea-Driven Organization. I recommend that really highly. Before that, his best-selling book, Ideas Are Free, also co-authored with Dean Schroeder, was based on a global study of more than 150 organizations in 17 countries, talking about how the best companies get large numbers of ideas from their frontline employees and the competitive advantages from that. So his new book, and we're going to spend a lot of our conversation on this, available now, co-authored again with Dean Schroeder, is called Practical Innovation in Government: How Frontline Leaders Are Transforming Public Sector Organizations. Alan was kind enough to send me a manuscript, and I was able to read and endorse the book. So a lot of great ideas there, and you can learn more at alanrobinson.com. So again, congratulations on the new book. And before we kind of dive into that a little bit, I was hoping you could recap first off. Like, if people don't want to listen to a whole episode about innovation and government, there's something for everyone to learn from your research. As you've said previously, about 80% of any organization's improvement potential lies in frontline ideas. Can tell us how that came to be discovered and how that applies in so many different settings?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We don't measure these things ourselves, but whenever we find companies or organizations, I should say, some government organ like the U.S. Navy and its research facilities measured it, we always jump on this measurement, which is that they will take often it's cost savings or revenue generation or some measure of outcome. And they sometimes, luckily for the world, but bad for them because it's really non-value adding activity, they tot up where the ideas come from. Usually it's because top leadership doesn't really believe that it's worth listening to the front line. So it's some middle managers making the case. But we have data from lots and lots of companies, and it always falls around 80 There's a large chemical company I'm not allowed to name, but you're wearing its products right now. It's 85-15 is their figure. And the funny thing is that number also holds for innovation as well. The number, if you actually measure where innovative ideas come from, it's usually between 70 or 80% start on the front lines, on the very bottom of the organization. Obviously, with innovation, they need management involvement and so forth. But if you just look at where they start, you get those similar numbers. So it's just data. And I do advise my consulting clients when they say, oh, should we measure it? You don't need to. I know what it's going to tell you. And why don't you just do it rather than spend hours adding up numbers that just tell you how much an idea saved or generated? You don't really need that information. So, yeah. But there are enough people who've measured it to give us the data we need.
Yeah. And I know from previous books that data is very consistent in different countries, different industries. It really turns out to be true.
Yeah, it's absolutely. Again, we don't control where it comes from, but we have, government, manufacturing, service, wherever people want to measure it. And luckily, I say luckily, because there's data. American Airlines used to track this data. It takes an average of 4 hours of a manager's or professional staffer's time to put a number on how much an idea is saved or generated. So when they're doing this, it's really chewing up a lot of their accounting capacity, but they always end up with 80%. So I say, please don't do it. And at least don't say, I told you to do it. Right. And usually the remedy is just top management education, because that's where the demand for that comes from. Mm-hmm. So it's just, we're lucky that number exists, because nobody should be tracking it except maybe some researchers.
Yeah. And then I wonder if there's a temptation. I mean, people like to say, well, my organization is different. I wonder, how much they say, well, okay, that might be true other places, but I don't know. I don't know if I believe it here. So that probably leads to them wanting them to add it up themselves.
Yeah. So we say the 80-20 principle is carefully worded. It says that 80% of your improvement potential lies in frontline ideas. So probably the biggest current problem in this area is that people put up a suggestion box, or online suggestion box is much more popular, but and they say, oh, I've opened the channel to frontline ideas and I'm not seeing 80%. Well, you need leadership. You don't just put a suggestion box on the wall. You need to train your people. Tapping frontline ideas is a long-term pact with your employees for constant training and increasing their capacity to solve problems and to notice things. And then you have to set up the systems to handle these ideas. And unfortunately, very few managers know how to do that. So they end up with a very weak channel, and they think that's what they're tapping, but they're really not.
Yeah. So I'm glad you emphasized that potential. I mean, thinking back to one of your previous books, ideas are free, but they're often not valued. Mm-hmm. Or, like you said, there's not structures in place. And, I think sadly, somebody might make, kind of a token attempt to gather ideas, and then quickly, it's almost like they're trying to prove a point. Like, well, see, I told you so. People aren't speaking up about their ideas. And like, well, how hard did you try? Did you create psychological safety that made it okay for people to speak up? Like, there's that kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy, it seems, unfortunately.
Yes. I've even been hired by unions to try to break down management so that they would listen to ideas from the union, so that they wouldn't close factories, thinking that it would be cheaper to go to a foreign country. And it's not, actually. If you can take very highly paid American workers, and if you use their brains, instead of just their brawn, then you're more than competitive with people who are just basing their competitiveness on low wages. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-huh. I don't draw a distinction between the two anymore. I used to, because I remember Dean. I wish I'd been there, but he interviewed the inventor of the Post-it note, who said that was one big idea and 237 small ideas. Art Fry. Because the truth is that an innovation, sending a starship to Mars, involves some big ideas, some small ideas. The big ideas enable the small ideas feed the big ideas, and the overall thing is the innovation. So I don't think you can be if you just try to separate out. And I remember in early thinking, like Misaki Imai had his graph with continuous improvement versus innovation. I remember the University of Chicago study that tried to compare the two. But the fact is, I think that any innovation that's big has hundreds of small ideas in it, as well as big ideas. So you kind of need all of that. So I guess what I'm now telling people is, if you want to be innovative, you need an ecosystem. You've got to be able to, as we wrote in the book, this recent book, you've got to be able to do it all together, because if you leave out any part, the whole doesn't work very well. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. But... No, that makes a lot of sense, the way you say that. And
you could even go with Toyota, which is known for at both ends of this, and you could say, well, the Prius or the new Mirai, the new Honda, the new hydrogen fuel car. That wasn't just, let's make a hydrogen fuel car. It's a lot of things together, and if they didn't get all the small ideas, the thing wouldn't work.
Right. And you could be a company that has very innovative products, but then if they're not tapping into their employees for continuous improvement, it seems like, back to that word potential, there would be a lot of lost potential. Like, even looking at, there's a certain factory in Fremont, California, that used to be run by Toyota and General Motors. It was very much aimed to be, that culture of continuous improvement. And the new owners of that building, namely Tesla, there's no dancing around that, are said to not have that same sort of culture, that it's very engineer driven, expert driven. And it seems like, again, like lost potential. Yeah.
I went there and I took my daughter there on a tour, just a little choo-choo train tour. And I think my undergraduates at Isenberg School would have picked up a lot wrong with that place on a speeding trolley. Because even my daughter, who's a medical doctor, was going, what's going on here?
This place, meaning once it was a Tesla factory?
Once it was Tesla. It was a disaster area. I don't mean to slander anybody, and it's probably changed since then. But there was most assembly lines in car factories, they snake around. They said, we don't do that. We go up one side and then it stops. And then a robot that's named after a Marvel character picks it up and puts it on the line that goes down the other way. And then it stops and it's picked up and put on the line going back. Why don't you just and by the way, the robots break all the time. And why don't you just sort of carry the conveyor belt around, and the thing can because Elon likes robots. But the place is shutting down all the time because the robots don't work, but it's cool. So it was fascinating to see that.
I bet. And I'll leave it at a positive. Like you said, things maybe have changed. Elon even made his own comments publicly when he tried to basically over automate the Tesla Model 3 line. His famous comment of humans are underrated.
Yeah, that's right.
And there is. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, his background wasn't manufacturing, but it was sufficiently different and eccentric that I actually asked my tour guide. I said, "Have you had anybody in here with any sort of manufacturing lean expertise?" And the answer was, there was one guy a while ago or something. So it just wasn't of interest. And that's a perfect example, because Tesla is trying to be incredibly innovative. But if their cars don't work and they break down all the time and they can't produce them, then they are less innovative than they could be.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully they're starting to tap into that potential that I know would exist there in their workforce. I know that one guy, and he's no longer there, and we'll save that for another time. But so let's get back to continuous improvement, and so anyway, I brought up this idea that not every company is on board with embracing frontline employee ideas. I mean, I'm going to ask a generalized question, which is probably difficult to answer, but you've been at this a long time. So let's say looking from like 25 or 30 years ago to now, do you see more executives who are receptive, if not enthusiastic, about engaging their frontline staff? Or, and I'll say this with an MBA degree, have MBA programs still just drummed into people's heads that they're the experts, they're going to have all the answers when they're executives? Are we seeing change?
Not as much as I'd like to see in that space. It's extraordinary. And I just think it's because the older paradigms are extremely strongly held. I think I'm certainly starting to understand more why it hasn't changed. And I think a lot of people are seeing that. I in Idea-Driven Organization, we wrote a lot about this group at Stanford that studies power and how it affects people. And of course, that's what managers have, is power. And if you go down that punch list of things that they discovered about people with power, not studying particularly improvement or innovation, they don't listen to people. They think they know better. I mean, it's just like a litany of things that mitigate against, cognitively against being able to take in any information from others. So yes, I think we're still very much stuck in the top-down sort of mindset. And I think that we also are not educating our managers as well as we used to. As you do, I deal with a lot of management education, and most of the places most of the large companies have completely hollowed. There's a few exceptions, have hollowed out their management education. They send them to one-day seminars, but they're not developing them like the U.S. military does, where they go to, they make the next turn in the pipeline and they go to some school for colonels, and then they go to a school for, generals, and there's more leadership development, and they're thinking about these things. The world has become so transactional that I think it's just a cost that often gets cut. So I'm fine. I think if we had that old world of where managers the people put resources into training their managers, I think this is what they would be trained in, but they're not. So
I would hope so. I mean, I think of, I wonder how many MBA programs are, they may be telling students about lean, but how deep they're getting into that, I don't know. And are they framing it as, cost reduction projects, or are they framing it as a culture and as a management system? Mm-hmm. I know there, Steve Spear at MIT has opportunity to teach some of the MBA students there about that. Another Sloan professor, Zainat Tan, great book. I've interviewed her, called The Good Job Strategy. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I know her. And she was an early Ideas Are Free sort of fan as well, which informs a lot of her work. In several of her sections are a lot about how you can get frontline people involved. And that's why you pay them more.
Yeah. So I'm glad she emphasizes that. But,
I can give you an actual, there's some data here.
Oh, great.
There is a group of, what's it called? The Lean Educators Summit that happens every year. And I went to the very first one, and it went out on a national mailing list. They invited all higher education people who are interested in teaching Lean to come. And do you know how many people came from the whole United States? 8 people.
I was going to guess 12.
Yeah. Well, 12 was filled out. Some professors from the home institution. I'm not really counting those.
Oh, okay.
The point was the interest wasn't there. And I also remember being at a meeting at LEI with some of the older Lean people. I include myself in that, and saying, why is there just not an interest in Lean? So it's actually not just frontline ideas. It's Lean in general.
Sure.
Struggled because it's difficult. It requires people to think, and it does require you to be open to ideas from others. I mean, that's a big part of it. Years ago, when I wrote my first book with Shingo, and I remember asking him a sort of a stupid canned question. I was way younger. What's the secret sauce to the Toyota production system? Everybody wants to know, and you always get a different answer. But he said, we, for the first time in history, which wasn't quite true, but we managed to set off mass creativity. That's what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who pointed me to these idea systems, 40 years ago. He said, that's really where the action is. You get the front line involved in constantly solving problems and making improvements. And so he kind of knew. There wasn't the data we have now, but he was battling that 40 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And that book, I have this book, and I forgot that connection between you and Shingo. So the book's title, I'll put a link to it in the show notes: Modern Approaches to Manufacturing Improvement, the Shingo System. That was back in the Norman Bodak Productivity Press days, right?
That's right.
So let's talk about and that conference, by the way. It's the Lean Educator Academic Network, something like that. The acronym for the group spells Lean.
No.
So one of the words is
Right.
weird when you have an embedded
network. Yeah, that
word,
makes sense.
But yeah,
and I wasn't. I was there. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed meeting the other 8 people in the United States who were interested in Lean. But there were only 8.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of the CEOs who I think is exemplar in terms of wanting employee ideas and valuing them and working toward that culture. Somebody who I've interviewed a number of times, Dr. Eric Dixon, who's been the CEO at UMass Memorial Health, not far from you. I still think it's an exception rather than the norm in healthcare for him to have that belief and that passion. They recently reached a milestone that's worth mentioning of 100,000 employee ideas that were implemented. Mm-hmm. And I think they would be the first to acknowledge that, not collected, but actually implemented. Yeah. So congratulations to all of them. But I want to acknowledge or hear you tell Alan a little bit of the story of your interactions with Eric and with UMass.
Well, I've known him a long time. He called me, I guess, right before Idea Driven Organization came. No, maybe it was 10 years ago. So before then, and he asked me. He was COO at that point of UMass Memorial, and he wanted to have me talk to his 800 people at the management at their management retreat. So I did that, and a lot of enthusiasm from him and people there. And then about a year later, I had an email, just random email that said, "This is Eric Dixon," and it was titled "New CEO Wants Idea System." And he had just been made CEO that day, and he was writing me. He was headed off to Hawaii, and he said, "I'm headed off to Hawaii. I want to talk as soon as I get back." But that was the first thing he wanted to do, as far as I could tell. I mean, it's on your first day on the job. You're So I am a teach to fish kind of person, and I sort of helped them. I trained they had a process improvement group. I can't remember the title of it, but there were sort of 8 to 10 professionals who were doing mostly process work, laying out mapping processes and helping teams. And Eric said, "I want this frontline thing and I want it sort of done right." So I trained them and I helped them set up their pilots. So we got them started, and of course to your original point, really, this is not rocket science. I mean, if you want this to happen in your organization, you can make it happen. It's not, at one level, it's not hard. At another level, it is hard because you're trying to raise the level of thinking that goes on in your organization, and that's tough. But anyway, Eric, because I'm a teach to fish person, and if you're a professor like me, I think I had to add it up. I'm probably close to 100,000 students now, and they go out there. I lose track of them after they leave, unless they contact me and say, "Here's how I'm doing." So you were the person who told me that they had 100,000 ideas. I'm thrilled. I'm happy for them. But I had no idea what they were up to since I left them.
Well, it sounds like you did a good job teaching them to fish, and that executive drive to not just take a stab at having a program like, we did some training and then nothing happened. Like it requires that energy and that recognition and everything that Eric does as a leader.
Yes. So he's a wonderful leader, and he models it well himself. And he understood he had a few years to think about this as COO, and he understood, and there's other organizations that have done this in the healthcare space, as you know. But and they've all had very special leaders and who were patient and thought in systems terms and were aware they'd meet resistance. It's fascinating. I'm watching one of my kids go through. She's just finishing up her residency now, and the sort of modern, but there's modern side to medicine, and then there's an incredibly archaic side. It's basically a medieval apprentice system with hazing.
Unfortunately,
that's what created the doctors. And so now you come in and say, now we're going to try to be an improvement culture. No, that's a tough shift.
Yeah, and Eric's also mentored by a former Toyota person from Georgetown, and like you said, they have this internal team. Some other great people who've come in from industry, some people who come from healthcare. So Eric would be the first to say he doesn't do it alone, but my gosh, he sets the tone, the direction, absolutely, and the expectation.
Yes, absolutely.
And on his blog, which he maintains as a CEO, he will publicly recognize people and celebrate the improvements. And I think that's one of the executive habits that a lot of people might say, like, well, I'm too busy. I'm going to delegate. I have an improvement person. But boy, when it comes from the CEO, even if someone, I think a lot of times, I can't speak for Eric's organization, an executive might have a process improvement person kind of feeding them, like, here's what we'd like you to highlight. But then the fact that they send it out themselves carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, no, he was a clear believer. I just go back to first day on the job. That's what he said his biggest priority was. And, we ran with that. So that's what you need. You need to be very dedicated and visionary to do this. But that being said, the steps you need to take are, I think, quite linear once you're past and become a leader of Eric's mold.
Like you said, it's not rocket science, or we could say it's not brain surgery, or it doesn't require degrees in applied mathematics.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
it's the same with lean as a whole. I would say it's not terribly complicated. It is systems thinking, which is very hard to, thinking fast and slow. Just made that point wonderfully. It's something we do not like to do as humans.
Yeah. But it's good that some people are leading that charge, and that they're asking you or others for help. So I'd love to shift the conversation now to different levels of government. Maybe a part of society, or part of societies that might not have a reputation for innovation, or kind of being on the forward edge of different management practices. But now that I've badmouthed government, and I didn't really need to do that, but the new book, again, is Practical Innovation in Government: How Frontline Leaders Are Transforming Public Sector Organizations. So from things that Alan has shared with us so far, I think the words and the title and the subtitle there aren't surprising. So I'm curious, first off, like, origin story for this book, of all the things you could research or look at or write about. Why this book? Why now? Why highlighting government?
As you know, it's been a while since I've actually looked at it, but I think the first line in the book is actually, "We did not intend to write this book." And I'm actually don't consider myself a writer. I do the writing to support my habit, which is going out and investigating stuff. I really enjoy that. But what happened was, after Idea-Driven Organization came out, we started to get a marked increase, both Dean Schroeder and I, in interest in how to do this in government. And we had a discussion by an earlier version of Zoom, and said, we've done a lot of work in government. I've done a lot of work in government, I mean, not just in the United States. And we've always left these organizations feeling it never stuck. We'd get some enthusiastic leadership team and training. They'd do things for a few months, and then it would die off, and somebody would get transferred. And so we sort of realized there was a moment when we said, we need to really take this for what it. Stop coming in as private sector experts saying all you got to do is be like business and you'll be fine. We have to study government as it is, go in, look at what's actually going on. John Cotter says this beautifully. His method of research is the same as mine, which is that you take a phenomenon and you look at some high performers, you look at some medium performers, and you look at some low performers, and you see what the differences are, and you write about what's actionable in all that. And that's all we did. We started looking out for examples of government organizations that were good at continuous improvement. Sometimes people think of, Navy SEALs. You'd never say they're used with reverence. They step into the private sector and everybody wants to pay them all kinds of money for motivational speeches. And we're looking up to government there, So there are some organizations. This coincided with a sort of emerging movement that we didn't trigger, but we were there from the inception. And that was that there were a number of government organizations that had kind of figured out how to do continuous improvement in their context. So we had our high performers, we had plenty of medium and low performers, and we sort of, as we were writing the book, we realized that many of the lowest performers that we were looking at, they only lasted for, their continuous improvement groups would last for 9 months, a year. Often we were tracking down people after they'd been sort of laid off or sent back to their main to their main job, so to speak. But we just decided we were going to study this phenomenon from scratch. And we were really surprised by what we discovered. It was, that what works in government is not what the private sector is telling them to do. We have had too many people coming in from, I won't name the companies, but saying, I know how to do this. And they have no idea how government works. Government managers face a whole different world. It's like, I think we were talking about healthcare earlier. This is very akin to what happened in healthcare early on. We had a lot of people coming in from the auto industry saying, here's how you should run your hospitals. We did a national survey of 900 doctors a few years ago, and they hated lean with a passion. And the comments in the comment section all sort of said, we deal with people. They have complex things. You can't crunch them into 10-minute slots and get cycle times and stuff like that. That doesn't time. It makes no sense in our context. And I think there was a lot of that going on in government too. And so once you actually look at, what separated the top performers from the bottom performers, it came back to what I'd been studying all along. It wasn't that we went in. Look, you pointed out rightly that the title of our book mentions frontline ideas and frontline leaders, and I've been doing that for 40 years. Oddly enough, when we took a completely blank slate look at government, said what's the difference between high performance and low performance and continuous improvement, it turned out to be involvement of frontline people. And when you do it properly in a government context, it really works. It's very powerful.
Yeah. Now, I remember, and gosh, I'd have to think, let me look real quick what year it was. Do you know the name Mike George? He's real well known for Lean Six Sigma.
Yep. I do.
Combining,
one of his books is behind me over my shoulder here.
Yeah. And I interviewed him back in 2011 because he was sort of pushing and to me, any of this should be nonpartisan. Like, we're talking about government. We're not talking about politics, but he was really pushing Lean Six Sigma. Now, he was trying to get candidates running for office at, let's say, for Congress, to sign this pledge that they were going to support Lean Six Sigma. And, what made me think of that was the difference between asking political leaders versus career government employees to be focusing on improvement. Do you think trying to influence or educate elected leaders is maybe the wrong place to focus? It's a leading question.
It's a great question. There is one place where I've seen politicians write it into their charter, and that was New Brunswick, where it's Canada. It's a campaign platforms that we're going to use Six Sigma. But you're right, it doesn't. So this is a fundamentally nonpartisan thing. We had in our study, we had almost 50-50 Republican administrations in cities, towns, states, and Democrats. You pick the size of government, you pick what you want government to do, and that's where our book takes over. We'll tell you how to do it, more efficiently and how to put improvement mechanisms on top of that. But the key thing, one of the key things we found was in the high performers that had to sustain for a few years. You can't really get anything started unless it lasts for a few years. It had to survive changes in political leadership. So we first learned this in a tiny little town in Sweden called Borås. And this town manager, it's probably, 50,000 people. And this town manager said to us, the key thing is you got to not have it identified with the political party. You got to get it into the way we, do our work. And then he gave us this lecture. We quote him in our book. He said, in government, one of the issues is that the nature of leadership is very different. The people on the top, that is the political class, are usually less well informed about how their organizations run than the people who work in them. And in business, that's exactly the opposite. So the key, one of our early sort of ahas was to start looking for how these leaders, and we have some examples in the book of some who didn't embed, like Tony Blair, for example, did deliverology. He had it in his own office, and it was Blair's deliverology. And guess what happened when he left office? The first thing they did was swept it out. But if you sort of put it into, the Office of Management and Budget or some other place where it becomes part of the machinery of government, and we didn't write this in the book, but that Borås example, what they did was they embedded the continuous improvement in the machinery of government. So there was like a door with finance on it and accounting and then continuous improvement, just along the corridor. And when the new political leadership came in, they had 3 days of orientation as to how government works. So they got oriented here's how the finances work, here's how here's how this continuous improvement work. And they just went, oh, cool. And it, on it went.
Yeah.
But you have to sort of untag it from the partisan side, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Because the next person's going to change it.
Yeah. I think one example of that, because healthcare in Canada is public sector, the province of Saskatchewan, maybe about 10 years ago, had the party in power had this really high-profile lean healthcare initiative that became controversial in many ways. There's maybe employee, if not public, resentment of bringing in. There's sensitivity to bringing in Americans. I know that from working in Canada. There was sensitivity to the large expense of flying in people from Japan. And it became a highly partisan issue. It became a campaign issue where the party out of power, looks for a wedge issue. And this really became, you'd think this would all be very obscure within the inner machinery of healthcare. But I thought it was sad that it became, partisan and then people dig in their heels. And even if they were to say, well, you could see some good results, they won't accept it. They're just going to criticize it no matter what. And the other party, it's probably not healthier to paper over any problems and say everything here is great. Don't look behind the lean curtain, if you will. But yeah, I appreciate your point about you see leaders from both parties. Newt Gingrich was heavily aligned with Mike George in that 2011, 2012 Let's Push Lean Six Sigma campaign. Newt Gingrich, for all of his faults, where there's a long list, but he was still in love with W. Edwards Deming. Yeah, in his philosophy and all. And then you have like the state of Washington. Lean has survived. I forget if they're highlighted in your book, but that survived from one Democratic governor to the replacement, which is also a Democrat. I think that's now Jay.
Actually gone through three governors.
Oh, better yet.
Yeah.
And then there are undoubtedly, I think of the city of Frisco, Texas. A lot of these city positions are probably nonpartisan, but it's a suburb. That may be quote unquote conservative leadership. They've really been embracing lean in different parts of city government there. They partnered with Toyota. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked here from asking you questions. But one of the positive examples was Frisco partnering up with Toyota to put together an amazing mass vaccination clinic, collaborating and working together with them. That would be maybe for your next research. You can go look at that. But I'm sure there are states or other areas where it's Republican or conservative government, because that's typically where the quote unquote run government like a business seems to come from, is from the Republican Party. But that question of like run it like a business, which business?
I just think, from what I've seen now, and I'm still, you're actually my first podcast on this. I haven't really talked to anybody about the book other than just our brutal editor. But I'm just sort of realizing that we never said there was just this long-standing assumption that the private sector knows best. We just need to hire all these people from all these exotic companies, and they'll come in and tell us how to do it. And actually, it's quite a different context. I mean, even people from Toyota are not used to dealing with complex missions and diverse sets of stakeholders and transparency on all their and changes in leadership and all this stuff. And it's the reality. And if you want to, change things, you got to deal with reality. So it's, I'm thinking out loud here, but, there's countless examples of famous business leaders who go into government and get killed because they don't understand how to build coalitions and, the politics of situations. They're used to just issuing orders, which is a much simpler world. So I remember in the Good to Great in the social sector, Jim Collins wrote that actually some of the best leaders we have are in government. They're just dealing with an order of magnitude more complex problems. So when you say, or not you, I'm not saying you, but when people say, oh, just hire these efficiency experts from private industry, it's probably a bad move. We need to develop a discipline, and that's why we wrote this book. We need to develop a discipline of how you do this in the government setting. How do you think about it?
Yeah. So where do you find the most adoption of practical innovation or idea systems or lean, like at the local or school board level, county, state, federal agencies?
We found it at all levels, actually. And, one of our early examples, and we have sort of 10 or 15 pages in the book about this, was the city of Denver. And we kind of watched, Michael Hancock, the mayor there, he campaigned. He had been in city council for, I think he told us 9 years, 10 years, 11 years before he became mayor. So he'd seen a lot of the problems. He'd seen a lot of people come in and try to force change in with private sector methods. And, he campaigned on continuous improvement. That was one of his platforms. And he said in a sort of frank moment with us, he said, I think this is going to be, my biggest legacy item to the city is creating a culture across the whole city. And of course, as you get further away from the front lines, you now are dealing with different set of issues because, as we wrote in the book, you have to kind of puncture down layers of management and get things to happen on the front lines for this type of continuous improvement that you can't yourself sort of see directly. So it was small units, just with isolated managers. Those were some of the first ones we met that made these incredible, transformative, innovative things happen, and all the way up to entire cities and states. Just different styles. So the book sort of divides into two parts. What do you do if you're running an entire large city or a state? And what do you do if you're a local frontline leader or middle manager? They're just different orders of problem. They're still pulling the same levers, but just in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my understanding in Frisco, Texas, I got invited in to visit. Like, it started in the library. Mm-hmm. With the director. They had business challenges. Like, Frisco is an incredibly high growth suburb. Population and demand for the library grows much faster than the tax base. There's kind of a lag there. Uh-huh. And they had this challenge of like, well, we have too many books that are out of stock or not available for people to come in. We can't buy more books. We can't build a bigger building yet. They had to improve the flow. Mm-hmm. Of like their big challenge mainly was like, from when that book gets dropped off, get it on the shelf for somebody else to check out as soon as possible. Instead of assuming it's got to be days, it could happen almost immediately. Like, literally smaller carts. Instead of accumulating a huge batch of books to go reshelf, they used smaller carts, which were also safer ergonomically for people to push on the carpeted library. So, to what you made me think of that is that library director was certainly empowered. Like, they brought in a consultant who was a library improvement expert, like somebody who had used lean in particular. And then that caught the attention of others within government up to like at least the city manager, to then start spreading this to other directions. And the people from the library started becoming kind of internal change spread champions.
That's how it happened in a number of states. We saw just one department sort of got it. It comes back. I guess Toyota uses this as strategy, the model line approach. You kind of create one thing and then everybody can go and get inspired by that. And that's one approach to doing it. And it's not the approach that, for example, Michael Hancock took. He tried to bring everybody along. He talked about, it's a little bit of a loaded term, but he talked about the coalition of the willing, which means he sort of started with the people who he could say would really want to do this. And then he went to the, early adopters, to the early majority, all that kind of stuff. But there are different approaches you can take, but that model, that organic model line one is one you certainly see a lot.
Yeah. There's different ways of introducing and spreading this. I think of maybe at the federal level, and correct me or add to this, the EPA has had a lean program. You can find lean pages about lean on the EPA website. And my understanding is that they're using those ideas internally. Think of the military. I mean, I've seen speakers at conferences from different branches of the military. Thinking
that
of
was,
that.
And the VA was another. They had it in their charter. They had a very proactive leader. And so I guess it depends on your entry point. Who are you and what are you trying to hold sway over here, as to sort of how you proceed to do it. And those were the things we had to kind of figure out, and we had to opportunistically go to the high performers we could find, because you mentioned Results Washington and the Lean conference out there. That's a national conference now. There's now a Canadian Lean Government Summit. So these ideas are spreading, and there's stuff going on in other countries too that's just mind-blowingly good, and it will gel. It's sort of, in our academic language, it's pre-paradigmic. People, it's like the early days of quality. Or should you use inspectors or should you process better? Now we're kind of figuring it out. And now we say inspection is bad, process is good. We have to get there with government too. There's a lot that still has to be figured out for sure.
Yeah. And I'll apologize to the audience, because usually about 30% of my listeners are from outside the United States. And so I apologize for having my local bias here. But whether it's the US or other countries, can you share, I know there's a lot of data, there's a lot of results that you've shared in the book. Is there a key, kind of quantitative example of the impact of practical innovation or idea systems that first comes to mind for you?
Well, that's interesting. Usually, and that's a great question. It depends on, and this is the way you embed yourself into a government setting so you don't get fired with the next change of administration, is you have to be trying to fulfill the strategic goals of the leadership. And if that's your function, they will keep you around as long as you have a track record of doing that. So those strategic goals have changed for, a lot of organizations. We wrote in the book about how, in the state of Washington, the oyster industry, we have actually a series of articles about this too, but in the Puget Sound, the oyster industry was failing due to pollution. And they had tried and tried to solve this problem. And then Results Washington was called in, and it applied some lean, and now the oyster industry is safe again. And it's a huge part of the, economy. And they had to literally track down individual septic tanks that were leaking because everything in Washington, the difficulty in Washington is it rains all the time. So everything's constantly flushed into the bay. So if I'm sitting on top of a hill right now, but if I was in Washington, my septic stuff would go into the bay, and they have dog poop and geese poop and, dairy farms and all kind. They had to track it all down and figure it out. And very, very 27 state agencies and like 5 federal agencies and 4 Native American tribes. And that's a typical government problem. And they figured it out. Yes, we've had Mind Lab in Denmark has become a model for, that's a policy setting institute. when we put laws into effect, we have no idea of their consequences. And they decided to have an institute that would study the impact of laws before they were made. And so they could save a lot of money on laws that could be implemented for much less expensively than people sitting in Washington would know with the information they had. So there's Highways England, which we don't even have them here. They have smart highways over there. They have their I forget the exact numbers, but their national highway system was rated for, I will invent the number, 10 million vehicles a day, and they're now at like 40 million vehicles a day on infrastructure. And they've been installing what's called smart highways. They've eliminated the shoulders to the roads. And if you break down, you pull over, and a system of cameras will immediately shut down the road behind you, and traffic will divert. And so they can use the shoulders dynamically. And at the time, there is no shoulder until somebody stops. And within 30 seconds, everything's flowing again. Stuff like that. They can reduce speed limits if there's bottlenecks. So they're pushing way more traffic through. And that was a classic, I would say, implementation of lean, but it had a twist in it. One of the other sort of high-level findings of our book is the private sector has a lot to learn from the public sector. There's stuff going on in the public sector in continuous improvement that the private sector is way behind on. And one of them is Highways England said, we have all these suppliers, and wouldn't it be cool if they all exchanged ideas and improvements between each other? And so we became one giant learning organization, and they figured out how to incentivize one contractor to tell another contractor of an improvement that contractor could use, because they had a system of cross payments and sharing profits and cost savings. And so all the contractors are phoning each other saying, if you paint it this way, it saves 12 hours. And they were calling their direct competitors with this stuff, and giving them improvement ideas, which would, that's not antitrust. That's something, but it's not antitrust. You're helping your competitors. So there was just a lot of, but it always depended on the context of, and this is why, business is kind of could be cynically said, it's all about money, but in government, they have so many different things they have to, sometimes people want better library books. Sometimes people want, more park areas, and sometimes people worried about the state of the roads. And, they have to just deliver and set those continuous improvement systems for what the needs are. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, I love how there are examples, and even just looking to the book description, they're about things like better service to the public, to citizens, constituents. The one example cited here, Denver Department of Excise and Licenses reduced wait times from 100 minutes to 7 minutes. Like, that's the kind of flow improvement that you would expect from lean.
It was 100 minutes, maximum wait times of 8 hours, because these were for commercial licenses for liquor stores and security guards and stuff. So it was not driver's license, but they reduced it from average of 100 minutes, maximum of 8 hours, down to literally nothing, 7 minutes first, and then 6 months later, literally nothing. And that was despite a doubling in the volume of licenses, because the economy is booming, and they never asked for any additional personnel. So when you look at that from the outside, back to one of your points in the beginning, is that innovation or what? It was all done through step-by-step ideas, but the outcome is totally different than what it was before. And Denver licensing actually went on to head, because it was deemed the showcase department, the most innovative department, to head Denver's marijuana. It was the first city to legalize recreational marijuana, and they had to figure all that out and license it. And they did that in addition to having no lines and the same personnel. I mean, that's Navy SEAL standard of excellence. Yeah. And there's just a lot of pockets of that around. We could all learn from.
I mean, it comes back to your point of people might say, well, businesses are only focused on money. I think we could say the best businesses focus on more than just the bottom line. Again, there's the difference between the cost cutters and the improvers, right? Where we'd say, well, better financial performance would be a result of providing better customer service and better quality, better safety, things like that. So I could see if a cost cutter was running the library, they would probably be tempted to say, well, let's save money by slashing the budget for books, and then maybe the public gets fed up and says, I wish I could use the library, but they never have books, so I'll just go buy a used book somewhere. And then they get out of the library habit, and then they might say, well, why is no one coming to the library anymore? And then they have to cut costs again. Right?
Yeah, and then running it like a business, a mistake we came across a lot was just subcontracting it out, and then giving your subcontractors incentives just to cut, without perhaps intending to. So that's why we said very often, we didn't really spell this out too much in the book, that when you treat government too much like a business, you just create a different set of problems, and they're often much worse, actually.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask two other questions about, one question about the title of the book, the phrase "practical innovation." Did you how did you center in on that phrase? Did you get better response from people that you were working with, or
Barry Kohler, our publisher, has a process that he uses for titles.
Okay,
and it's a Qualtrics survey that they send out, and we did like 4 or 5 rounds of them. We had to send them out to like 3,000 of our contacts, and I believe you were one of them. I don't know if you responded or not. That was not
probably did. Yeah, if they used your name, I probably did. Yeah,
I appreciate that. And they'd say, we have the following sort of 10 titles. Which do you prefer? And then they had subtitles as well, and they would mix and match and note trends. We noticed we had I forget the name of the actual title we had, but that you can slice and dice this data in beautiful ways. And one point we found there was a 70% response rate. Everybody loved this title, but there were 30% who just said no. So then you started slicing, and it was the people in government who hated it. Yeah. So I said, well, I think our audience, the primary audience is probably government people. So let's take that message. And I think the message of the title said, how you can be more like a business or something. That assumption took us 2 years to break.
Wow. Yeah,
before we were able to say, let's just look at government for what it is, as it is, and see what works and what doesn't there. Stop coming in from an outside perspective. I've been in the private sector, as you have, for decades, and I've seen some incredibly good stuff. And it was temptation to say, oh, just do that in government. But Collins put his finger on that years ago when he said, people in business are used to much more top-down. People follow orders. They have much more control over resources and actions. And so you're operating in this kind of haze in government where you've got to make coalitions happen and get stakeholders involved. And that requires a lot more leadership than we have. Absolutely.
Yeah, real leadership instead of falling back on power and hierarchy and command and control.
Yes, and if you try to do that in government, it just doesn't work. You last a few years, and then you're thrown out, and everybody says the person didn't really change much.
Yeah. So, it seems like one dynamic with government is, budgets and budgeting cycles, and people in private sector or nonprofit healthcare. If you ask them, what do you need to improve? Like, to me, it's always the mores, right? I need more people. I need more space. I need more money. Does practical innovation help governments get past that trap of saying, like, well, hey, there's a lot we could do, but we don't have the budget? Like, finding ways to actually improve within existing budget.
Yeah, it does. I think that's actually at the very heart of it, because what we found was that this kind of management-driven improvement, meaning where managers make most of the improvement calls, which is the most prevalent form in business. When people came in and tried to do that in government, it didn't work. So they went to frontline improvement. And that consists of, in the case of, say, Denver licensing, which you just brought up, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small ideas, which cost almost nothing to implement, and so it's this, I think we have an entire chapter on the book about why managers miss these. They're largely invisible. They're off the radar screen to anybody who's not doing the work. So, to give you one example, we talked, one of the ideas we wrote out from Denver licensing was they have people have to do the criminal background checks to get licenses to be security guards and stuff and teachers. And they had a terminal in the lobby where you could do it yourself, but it was so confusing that almost everybody would get up and approach the desk, and a licensing technician would have to come out and help them. And now nobody outside of the waiting lines or the technicians really knew about that problem. And somebody said, why don't we just write a clear set of instructions so that people can, with screenshots, people can do it themselves. And you take that idea, it saved 35 interruptions per day, 5 minutes each. You do the math, it works out to something like 780 hours a year. That when you just clean up this manual, takes 780 hours, is like 20 weeks full time for somebody. So, and then you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those, but each one is deceptively small. You say, oh, I don't really have, it's not really important. We need to think about the big stuff. But when you get hundreds of things like that, pretty soon you're running a totally different department. And so there weren't any budget items. I'm trying to think, going back to Denver licensing, I can't name anything that cost them money of any kind. It was all just process improvements that they did. And so there was just like maybe you could say the paper for printing the clear instructions, but it was all at that level.
Yeah, just and minimal.
I think the cumulative impact of all these invisible ideas, and that's the 80/20 principle, is just enormous. And it requires managers to be educated so they know that, like Eric Dixon knows, that's where the real action is in his organization for moving it forward.
Yeah. That's a very I recognize that dynamic of people, frontline staff or leaders, kind of discounting like, well, that idea is not worth anything. But when you see hundreds or thousands of ideas, and suddenly like, okay, wow, now that's making a cumulative difference. And that's the difference between, like, I think maybe the habit of certain types of businesses that would demand ROI analysis before any idea was improved. That seems like a kiss of death for any sort of idea program or innovation.
I don't know if you can see over my shoulder, but I use the shoebox method of research. I sort of pick a topic that I'm interested in, and I write little notes and tear stuff out and put it in. And I also do it on the computer. But one of my shoeboxes for a long time was, and I have yet to write this article, was about cost benefit analysis, which is astonishingly poor tool for what it's set up to do. And people, Amartya Sen, probably the most famous living economist, wrote an article, Why Cost Benefit Analysis is Stupid. That's the title.
I'm going to look that up.
And I remember I worked a lot in England, and it was kind of a joke, but I remember the head of a large insurance company that I was working for. He was asking for ROI on all the ideas, and people were saying, it's just creating a lot of work for us. So I had to go into this man, and he actually said, I have a first in physics from Cambridge. And I always been told, I went to London Business School, always been told that, you manage businesses by the numbers. You got to help me out with this. And I was feeling frivolous. I have a tendency to be inappropriate when I deal with pompous people. I said, I can give you the half-hour explanation or the 30-second explanation. And he said, well, okay, I'll try the 30-second explanation. And I said, cost-benefit analysis was invented by the French. And he kind of went forward. He had the worsted suit on and everything. And he said, I think I'm going to need more than that. But it's actually, you go back to the original. Have you ever had a chance to read the original article proposing cost-benefit analysis? It's an actual point in time where the day before it didn't exist. And it was written by a French industrial engineer. And when he sort of says, here's what you should do, but watch out for the following things. This technique is only useful for the simplest of decisions where you only have one or two variables. Don't try to do it after that. It's all hand waving. My worry is that because it's the first quantitative technique, this was in 1841 before the
Civil War.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
My worry is because it reduces it to one number, managers will take this too seriously. Then I have some studies somewhere in here. I'm dying to write this article when I get time, but I have another one I'm even more excited about. But there was another article on cost benefit analysis that came out that said it's wrong. What is it? How does it work? 80%. No, the average cost benefit analysis is off by 80%. And it's frequently off by more than 100%, meaning that was they did some studies of how, because it's meant to predict something. What it's meant to tell you is you change something, this is how your bottom line is going to change. So you can actually test it if you have enough time and energy. So it's off plus or minus 80%. And if I propose that to you now, you'd say, I don't have time for a tool like that. That's ridiculous. But we use it. And then it's frequently off by more than 100%, meaning that it's telling you to do something you shouldn't, or telling you not to do something you should. That's just crazy.
And there's so many cases where, I mean, at some point in my career, I think I came up with this notion that, well, if an executive wants to do something and there's not a good cost benefit analysis, they'll call it a strategic initiative.
Yes.
Or how many times are people just saying, give me the cost benefit analysis that proves this is a good idea? Like, that sounds like a waste of time.
To your point, that is exactly how I break leaders out of the cost benefit. I say, this isn't really, let's not measure. What are your strategic goals here? If you were running a top restaurant in a big city, would you be saying we want cost savings ideas and ROI on every? No, you understand that if it is a strategic initiative, if you have great service and great culture and good food, the money will take care of itself. So you look at the drivers. And so you're absolutely right. That's the flip. And so I often find myself, I'm working in some very financially driven organizations right now. And I just kind of say, well, what's your strategy? And they say, oh, well, we're going to go, buy this land in Florida. And okay, well, let's do that. Well, and then the money will fall. But if you're questioning people about the dollars all the way along, it's a recipe for, it's actually, completely valueless.
I very much look forward to you writing that article. So please let me know when that article's out. As we wrap up here, just a couple maybe final questions. So I think we've known and we've seen from experience and reports and research, or what have you, that people in any country can do continuous improvement. That it's about the leadership and the organizational culture. We know the French can do it. We know people in any country can do it. But we also know not every company in Japan is a Toyota culture.
Oh yeah, there's not appallingly bad Japanese companies.
Yeah, so there's always that danger in generalizing. But now back to when it comes to government, did you find, like, if people would expect Japanese government to embrace some of these ideas, do you have any evidence of that or any examples of government in Japan?
No, government is notoriously inefficient in Japan. But I did work for the Singaporean government for a number of years. They have a lot of stuff right. I mean, that country, and I hate to say this as an American, is probably 15 years ahead of where we are. You step into the future, and it's all little stuff, but it's a driven leadership. And I remember reading I'm not being political at all, but I remember working in Singapore. I read an article and it said, was it Lee Kuan Yew, who just died, their leader, said he was worried because Singapore's growth rate was now 15% GDP, 15% growth per year. And unless we hired more of the best and the brightest from the world and lured them to Singapore, we weren't going to be able to sustain that growth rate. I get back to the United States, and the headline was exactly how we got to keep these, people out. And I work in a university, and we actually spend U.S. taxpayer money educating the world, and then we put them out right after they got their computer science degree.
Right.
So it's
instead of starting a company here, for example.
Yeah, it's just a completely different philosophy. So Singapore is a continuously improving, innovative. Their government, it just values this stuff. And as we said throughout, actually, this is not rocket science. They've done a good job. Japan, I've spent a lot of time there. My brother worked there for 12 years, and my dad was a professor at Tokyo University. The Japanese government has, as far as I'm aware, not embraced these. And this is a fairly recent, maybe I should reiterate, this is a fairly recent movement worldwide. I mean, it's probably 6 or 7 or 8 years old. But what's changed is people have discovered what really works. And so that part I see expanding rather quickly. It will, for improvement in oriented leadership.
Yeah. In Singapore, like, for example, the airport, which that's got to be public sector, is world renowned as being the best airport, best managed organization.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they do all kinds of things that are, they're just stunning. They recycle all their water. Malaysia tried to cut them off from water. There's always been a sort of, Singapore broke away from Malaysia. And they had a contract on their water. And the previous prime minister of Malaysia said, because Singapore has no natural source of water, when it expired in 2015, I think it was, this is the story, they were going to quadruple the price of water, which would have wrecked Singapore because it all came over the Johor Straits in a pipe. And so Lee Kuan Yew, with their continuous improvement, he said, Singapore has to be 100% self-sufficient in water within 5 years. And so now they had the initiative was called IPU, literally, meaning that stuff that goes down the drain is all recycled. They have recycling plants. They had 80% of Singapore is a catchment area. So whenever it rains, which it does a lot, they catch it. And now Singapore, when I was at this factory, Arnold Schwarzenegger was coming the next day with a delegation from California to learn how you could have it so that anything flushed down your sink or toilet would appear in water. It's the way it happens in nature, right afterwards. And the upside of the story, the end of it is that Singapore, once they cut off that pipe, they have their own water now. Malaysia was trying to set up a big port right near Kuala Lumpur with container shipping. And Singapore bought the two largest shipping companies and that shipped there and diverted all their shipments to other countries as a punishment for that. But I'm not, no political statement there. It's just like 5 years to self-sufficiency in water and slamming back this country that tried to cut them off. It's really interesting.
But it comes back to strategic goals or strategic imperatives.
Right.
Yeah. And they took that on. So it would be interesting to see what Japan. I'm sure your book will make its way to Japan in English if it's not translated. And look, going back 10 years ago, people would have pointed, people within Japanese healthcare would say back then it was still very rare for a Japanese hospital to be embracing the Toyota production system or lean or whatever we call it.
Yes.
And but that's been picking up. Toyota in Japan is now working with at least one hospital nearby them. And, they may not be the first mover with certain technologies, if you will, but, they'll catch up and there'll be things to learn from them. Like final story I'll tell about that is, American hospitals from Seattle that would go to Japan to learn from factories because they would say, we want to learn from the best organizations and we don't want people to be just copying what some other hospital did, or that's not the best organizations in Japan. And so then they bring these lessons back to Seattle. And you know where Japanese hospitals were going to learn about lean?
Virginia Mason?
Yeah. They're flying to Seattle instead of cutting out the middle organization.
And interestingly, she was also one of the people who endorsed our books, Wendy Corthu Smith, founded and used to head Results Washington. So she moved from government across to healthcare at the highest level. So, they sort of certainly respected what she'd done in government.
Yeah. And, they've had a CEO, Gary Kaplan, Dr. Kaplan, incredibly supportive of lean and improvement. And as he's retiring, he it sounds like, the intent is that the new CEO is going to continue this forward. So I hope that continues to be a good place to go and learn from. So, Alan, thank you for being, so generous with your time here. I mean, it's great talking with you. And the book, again, the most recent book, and again, I can't recommend enough. Again, going back to the book with Mr. Shingo, I lost that the manufacturing improvement book, but ideas are.
It was modern approaches to manufacturing improvement. Was that?
Yes. Yep. Yes. Thank you for that. Ideas are free. The idea-driven organization, more recent and really impactful books for me. And then again, the new book, Practical Innovation in Government, How Frontline Leaders Are Transforming Public Sector Organizations. So as you're listening to the podcast, it's available now. You can go learn more at alanrobinson.com. You can find the book anywhere you would find books online, I suppose. So Alan, thank you again. And congratulations to you and Dean on the launch of the book. And I'll look forward to talking to you again someday.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.